conditions on the fob were horrific. I mean, I tell people to this day, it was the most horrific place I've ever been in my life. Hopefully I never have to experience that again.
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Abu Ghraib. Yes, I'll say it again. Abu Ghraib. You remember those pictures? The graphic images of inmates tortured and abused by U.S. service members in Iraq. Photos that sparked domestic and international outrage and condemnation back in 2003. Abu Ghraib wasn't just a prison. It was also the forward operating base in Anbar province for U.S. operations there. Major Bill Edwards and Lieutenant Colonel Bob Walters of the 165th Military Intelligence Battalion were given the near impossible task of setting up and then improving discipline issues at the site. They've recently published a candid first-hand account of their time there, entitled Inside Abu Ghraib, Memoirs of Two U.S. Military Intelligence Officers. RANE's Executive Director of Safety and Security, Brian Lynch, recently spoke to Bill Edwards about his experiences.
Bill, welcome to the broadcast. We're going to be talking about your recent book, Inside Abu Ghraib. And Bill, great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's great to be here. I'm actually honored to actually do this podcast with you. I'm excited as well. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your service to your country, to our country. This book really highlights, I think, a couple of things. Number one, the types of issues that had to be overcome during Operation Iraqi Freedom, one which you highlight in the book, as well as the impact to families. And I'd like to get into all of that with you as we move through this. But let's start, Bill, a little bit with your football career and your entry into the service. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't know if it was a career, but it was my passion as a young man. I had started playing competitive football at about the age of 6, and made my way all the way through high school, and then played for some college teams. Had some opportunities to continue into a Division I school, but decided at that point that my calling was the Army. So I went to the ROTC detachment at San Diego State University and asked about getting into their program.
And you went from obviously one team with the mission to another team with the mission. And I thought kind of an interesting comment by the physician when you went for your physical. Can you relay that to the folks?
Yeah, that was the eye-opening moment where I realized I was never going to be an NFL player. I was a freshman reporting into what was our entry week for the summer training camp, and every freshman goes through a physical with the team doctor. And I was waiting in the lobby, and they called me in to get my physical, and the doctor said, "Are you the new kicker?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if you're not the kicker, you're way too small to be playing in this league."
And I think the comment that he made, which is quite enlightening, is we've got to put some weight on you, or you're going to get killed.
They actually did. After that first season, I actually grew into the position. The position I was playing was wide receiver. I was a receiver. I wasn't a speedy receiver. I was more of a possession receiver. I could get 10 yards if we needed 10 yards. And that's actually how I was recruited later on, a few years later, the one opportunity I actually turned down.
Well, and then you go to San Diego State University, and I think there were some trailers that had a sign on it about ROTC. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. I was sort of like all young people at that age, and you're trying to figure out what you want to do and the path you want to take. And I just happened to be walking by these temporary trailers. They were pretty common in the 70s and 80s, to use as classroom space or meeting space or offices in lieu of like formal buildings. and on the this trailer there was a sign that said Army ROTC. So I said, oh, I'll go in here and ask some questions about what this is all about in this program. And that's where I met a dear friend of mine to this day, Captain Pete Ash, now physician, MD, Dr. Pete Ash, who brought me into the program, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's a great story. And then that's around 1987. And then you get assigned to Berlin, which was for you a great assignment because what happened in Berlin in 1990, Bill?
Well, yeah, it was a great assignment. One of actually my if I ever get asked what's my claim to fame is I was the last armor officer, U.S. Army officer assigned to the Berlin Brigade before we cased the colors in 1992. So the bad part about that is that I was the junior lieutenant the entire time I was there, and that's never good. And so, but in 1990, I was really blessed and fortunate to meet Dana, who I eventually married, and we've been married for the last 30 years.
So let's fast forward up to 9/11, the terror attacks that occurred. I believe you were at the University of Tennessee. You were training some Reserve Army Training Corps cadets. And can you take us through that and how you found out and what your initial thoughts were?
Yeah, that was a really interesting day. I was an ROTC instructor at this time. This was a position that I took after I had company command in the 4th Infantry Division. What we were doing in those days, once you came out of company command, you had a couple of options to go to the training centers to impart the knowledge you had on the next generation of leaders. And so I decided to take this position at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And the interesting part about the decision was my assignments officer at the what was called Human Resources Command at the time, or PERSCOM. He sent me a list of schools to choose from. There were various ROTC um, openings across the country, and I simply just picked the best football school. So that's why I ended up at the University of Tennessee. They happened to be very good in the SEC at that time, and I was a huge football fan, so I thought it would be great to go there and teach and also get to see SEC football up front. So that's how I ended up at the University of Tennessee. And then I was actually the recruiter and the physical training instructor at the school in our program. So I had the students every morning at 6 a.m. for PT, and then the rest of my time was just recruiting and bringing more students into the program. So on 9/11, I was at work. I was at the school. I was actually with several cadets, and we were watching an old TV that had been donated to the program, and we just were sort of in shock as we were watching these events take shape. And I turned around to these students. They were still students at the time, and I said, "Your lives have just changed." And they looked at me and they said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Look, this is an attack on our country, and you are all getting ready to be lieutenants in the Army. So you've got to be prepared mentally to deploy at this point." And as it turns out, we all know that that's what happened. And those specific cadets that I was with at the time, um, they they all went on to serve multiple tours in combat, and some are in very senior leadership positions today, which makes me feel old, but they are.
So, as we all know, fast forward timeline here, March to May 2003, the U.S. leads a coalition which invaded Iraq, dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom 1. And then you join General Walter's battalion. I think at the time he was a lieutenant colonel in June of 2003. Can you take us through those events briefly, Bill, about that assignment leading up to meeting General Walters, Lieutenant Colonel Walters at the time?
Yeah, sure. No, so it was I was a student at the Command and General Staff College, which is at Fort Leavenworth. It's where normally all the majors in the Army and other services go there for professional development and education, further education. And we were in school, and obviously all of this was taking shape. And our instructors came to us and some of the senior leaders at the school and said, "Look, you may get pulled out of school early to join units um, that are heading to the Middle East." And so we were all preparing mentally. But at this time, I had been in the Army um, over. I think I was at 13 years or 14 years in the Army, so I was fairly senior at that time, and so it was part of life, for me and my family at that point. So getting those type of instructions or orders was wasn't overly shocking. So basically, what we were trying to do was figure out where we were going. And I had initially been assigned to a different brigade while I was at school, and as we finished the coursework and graduated in the May timeframe of '03, I was in a hotel in Kansas City waiting to fly myself and my family to Germany when I got an email saying, you have been diverted and you're going to now be the executive officer for the 165th Tactical Exploitation Battalion. It was an MI battalion in the 205th MI Brigade under 5th Corps, and this was a great this was a great assignment. I mean, this was just pure good luck, and I found out later that Bob had actually picked me to come and be his executive officer. He was the commander of the battalion at the time, and then the rest is history. I ended up getting to Germany. I got Dana and my children settled in a couple days, but she actually ended up doing all the work. And the next thing I knew, I was on an aircraft headed for Baghdad International Airport is where I ended up, and then the story of OIF-1 begins for me at that point.
And I believe the initial assignment was in Balad, if that's right. And you were really not expected to go and be with the change of orders of change of mission to Abu Ghraib. Is that correct?
Well, the unit, the 165th, after the initial invasion, had stopped in Balad, and that's where they set up the headquarters. So Balad was the battalion headquarters. Abu Ghraib wasn't on our radar. It wasn't even in our mission set, and we'll get to that, I think, a little later in this conversation. But um, that change of mission we got for Abu Ghraib was the result of a strategic issue that was taking shape at that facility.
Yeah. So before we get into the change of mission to Abu Ghraib, let's talk a little bit, Bill, about the impact to families when the soldier is deployed in wartime. And this was a combat transfer to Iraq, right? We're in Operation Iraqi Freedom 1. You really didn't get to set up the home. And can you take us a little bit through that about what the impact that transfer and that deployment has on a family?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is probably one of the strongest portions of this book, and it just needs to be highlighted. Is one of the reasons why we wanted our wives and daughters to tell their stories. But the Army family, uh, by far, it has to be a strong unit. And in my case, I was completely blessed uh, with Dana as my wife, and then two young girls at the time, Madeline and Elise. But this situation was even more unique than the normal military family situation. One, I was deploying to combat. I was deploying to a unit that was in combat. It was a unit that had a long-range surveillance mission, which is an infantry mission, and it also had a intelligence mission. So it was a very complex organization, and we were operating. This organization was operating all over the country in a decentralized manner. But then back to the family. The family was actually our families were actually living in Germany, so they weren't even in the U.S. with the normal support structure. They were in Germany, and then trying to figure out how to just do the basics in a foreign country while your spouse is deployed is very challenging, and you have to be a strong person to do that, and your children have to be resilient. And that right there sets the conditions for how important it is to understand the strength of the military family as it pertains to supporting not only the spouse that's in the service, but the entire structure of our army. It is truly a part of our culture that just needs to be recognized and understood.
First of all, the book is a great read, and it really talks about what you and others in the unit that you were in, but others in the Iraqi theater of operations went through. But it also really talks about the impact of the family, and I thought that was extremely powerful, as you mentioned. So let me go back to the change of mission to Abu Ghraib, and a lot of folks remember that it was a prison, but it was also a forward operating base. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the difference of what your unit did versus maybe what the military police unit did?
So, like I said in the earlier, I didn't even know where Abu Ghraib was on the map. So we were again in Balad. We were conducting our operational missions out of LSA Anaconda, which was basically the airfield at Balad. And then we got a change of mission to move to Abu Ghraib, and as I tell the story in the book, the change of mission was fix it. And for a seasoned or a long-term military officer, that's not a real mission. The real mission normally comes with task and purpose, and then you can go from there to establish the standards and the conditions that you want to operate in. So I had to reiterate with my friend in Baghdad. I said, "So you're telling me the mission is to fix it? What does that mean?" And he's like, "Bill, you just need to fix it. Get down there and do an assessment, and then get it straightened out." So Abu Ghraib was a prison. It was a Saddam Hussein prison facility. I believe it was built in the 50s. It was an execution facility, so the gallows and all of those really horrible things existed on that facility. But it was also in this time a detainment facility for the U.S. military in Iraq at the time. For us, we found out later. I mean, it was a huge strategic blunder by the unit that was currently on that fob, and that's in the news, and everyone's well aware of Abu Ghraib from that perspective. But when we got the mission, our mission was to move our battalion down there and establish discipline, standards, and accountability, and also run operations out of Abu Ghraib in the form of FOB operations, so forward operating base operations. So Abu Ghraib was technically a detainment facility, but it was also a forward operating base for our unit.
And Bill, you touched on the conditions that you found when you arrived, and I'd like to get into that. But the operating base, and I want you to talk about this later, is you had long range surveillance teams, And they were inserted, they hid, they watched, they reported back. And I want you to talk a little bit about how important they were to the intelligence gathering mission. But before we do that, I think it's really important and interesting that you convey what the status was, the pulse check, when you first arrived. What did you see from the standpoint of military discipline?
Yeah, this is a great point. So after the call that we took, or I took the call in Balad to again go fix Abu Ghraib, less than 24 hours later, we were conducting a leader's reconnaissance down from Balad to Abu Ghraib to assess the conditions and then really establish a plan on how we were going to execute this mission order we were given. So, think in terms of that night, we were organizing our combat patrols in Balad. We were telling people, hey, look, we've got to change a mission. We need to do a leader's reconnaissance. And the leadership, to include myself and Bob and our operations officer and our battalion sergeant major, all the key leaders and a couple of the company commanders, really all the key leaders that needed to see what this place was about. We established a couple of combat patrols, and we left Balad and made the combat patrol movement down to Abu Ghraib. And when we rolled on to Abu Ghraib, my initial sense was there was no discipline, there was no standards, and there was no accountability at all. There was no functioning entry control point. The conditions on the FOB were horrific. I mean, I tell people to this day, it was the most horrific place I've ever been in my life. Hopefully I never, have to experience that again. But we had a daunting task at that point. And when we actually got onto Abu Ghraib that next day, our non-commissioned officers, who are by the way, were the greatest in the Army. I can't give them enough credit, and I'm still in contact with many of them today. They started immediately assessing the FOB perimeter, the conditions of weapons, the security of the FOB, and then by the end of that day, we were huddled around Bob's Humvee truck, talking about, okay, here's our plan, here's how we're going to execute this mission. But for us, it was just shocking to even see the conditions of that facility.
Shocking, as you mentioned, but probably not surprising that there were some issues there based upon what you found. And I think you made a comment in the book: leadership failure equals mission failure, and I think that's probably a pretty good example of that, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Bob Walters was our battalion commander, and he was, I think, and still is. I admire him greatly, but the epitome of leading us at that point. And then really the four legs of the chair at the leadership level were myself, the battalion operations officer, and then the command sergeant major. And so the four of us, I talk about this a lot now, but we were put into a position where we were going to have to lead through adversity, and it was just the right team to do it, and just great human beings that understood what needed to be done, completely professional, such a disciplined organization ourselves, with our non-commissioned officers led by our sergeant major and our first sergeants and our platoon sergeants and our company commanders. And because a leadership is not about one person, leadership is about the team. And we had a good team, and I think the Army made the right decision to move us down there to, as I said earlier, fix that situation.
We'll get back to our conversation in just a moment. Individuals and organizations turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. To learn more about RANE, go to ranenetwork.com/join to become a member today.
And you were operating in that area. You had a mission. And can you talk about the threat to life that occurred on a routine basis there, both from mortar and rocket attacks, and how that impacted operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was a target of opportunity. It was a place that received mortar and rocket fire on a daily basis, sometimes more than once a day. It wasn't uncommon for small arms fire to take place outside of the fob, and then of course directed towards the fob. So we were constantly under that type of environment. And one of the things I tell people is there are on Abu Ghraib at the time there were buildings, right? There were prison facilities, there was a textile factory, there were hard stand facilities, and we stayed and operated out of those facilities. But when we left those facilities, which was all the time, we had to be in our full combat equipment. We had to have our body armor on, or our flak vest at the time, and we had to have our helmet on. It was a situation where we never knew when the next rocket or mortar or small arms or RPG was going to come over the perimeter walls. And so living in that type of environment, um, I hate to say it, you sort of get used to it, but you always have to have your senses with you, because you just never know what's going to happen. And frankly, at the time, the detainees on that fob, they were in tents all around the grounds of that fob. So it was actually even dangerous for them, and it was an environment that didn't change the entire time we were there.
Can you talk a little bit and paint the picture of what living conditions were like when you first arrived there for the average soldier? Just to paint that for our listeners.
Yeah, so if you can think of the most austere camping or outdoors environment you've ever been in, with literally no services, but also the filth of of um, of this specific place, it was it was just like I said earlier. It was horrific. We didn't have um, latrine facilities. We didn't have the ability to shower. We didn't have running water. All of that we had to bring in and build ourselves. So basically, we were living, and we were capable of doing that in what we call a field environment in the Army. But in this instance, the infrastructure wasn't supported at all. So I give the great example of we had a couple of Iraqi contractors that would work for us and help us, get some things done that we needed to get done from an infrastructure perspective. But my S4 at the time, the S4 is the term for the logistics officer in the battalion, was a guy named Romeo Qureshi, and we highlight him in the book because he was such a fantastic officer. He could just see what needed to be done, and then he could get it done, and it was all about improving the life conditions for our battalion and our soldiers while we were there. So one of the first things we did was we built plywood showers, and we used our Iraqi contractors to help us build those showers. And we were pumping the water out of what we call water buffaloes with little pumps to bring in a shower capability. But they were so austere. You had to wear some sort of shoes while you were in there because the mud was so thick in this part of the country, and it was just literally the most austere conditions you can imagine. In fact, one of the improvements we were making later on was just laying gravel all over the fob so that we could keep the mud and dust down. But when you live in that type of environment, it also promotes disease. And so we had to be very careful with soldiers getting sick and trying to keep everyone as healthy as possible. And so it was a struggle from that perspective. So not only were we operating under the conditions of constant fire, indirect fire and small arms fire, et cetera, but we're also fighting the elements and fighting the conditions of hygiene. And so some of the pictures you see in the book sort of highlight how that facility looked, but it, to say the least, it wasn't ideal.
So not only were the living conditions less than ideal, but the group, including yourself, were under rocket and mortar attack on a continual basis. Look, I know that you're the type of guy that probably won't blow his own horn, but in the book you noted you did a couple of things like establishing the internet cafe for the soldiers, up armoring vehicles. I'd like to have you talk a little bit about that. That was in the early stages of the IEDs and some of the other items that were occurring. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe a little bit of the frustration around that too, Bill?
Well, during this time, I mean, the Army, when we deployed to Iraq, we were completely capable of destroying the Iraqi Army. And I think if you look into history, I think we completed the mission in something like 17 days. We were a trained army. We could move, we could shoot, we could communicate, and very good at our craft. When we went into Iraq, when the mission changed in the summer of '03, when we faced our first what we learned later was called the IED, the entire dynamics of the battlefield changed, and so we had to make that change as well. One of the things that I noticed, and just also talking to the NCOs and the young officers, is that we didn't have enough armor on our vehicles to protect ourselves as we went out into the environment. It was simply just a matter of how we deployed into theater. But when conditions changed, we needed to change. So I came up with the idea of, and it wasn't, I don't think it's my intellectual property. I mean, I saw it happening, but I came up, at least for our unit, I came up with the idea, let's up armor our vehicles, let's get steel in here, let's do what we can to protect our soldiers as they go out on patrols. And basically that's where it ends. So it becomes the idea that I talk to the logistics officer Romeo and to the company commanders, and I say, hey, guys, let's get this stuff going. And then at that point, the unit was so proficient, they just took it and and ran with it, and they got all of our vehicles up armored with doors and turrets and machine gun mounts and all kinds of different creative solutions. And I give all that credit to them. I mean, one of the roles of a leader is establish an idea, have a vision, but then your team executes that vision. And this team was phenomenal at that. And I tell a funny story later on in the book about when we were redeploying. Maybe we'll get to it, but it's about actually taking that stuff off of the vehicles when we get back to Kuwait in 2004. So I'll leave it at that. But it's about the team.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. But it was your vision that got that started. So I just wanted to make sure I highlighted that. One other thing relative to the intelligence capability of the unit and how important information from a walk-in was relative to the location and the mission against Saddam Hussein's sons. Somebody could have just ignored it, but that didn't happen. Can you talk a little bit about that, Bill?
So we had a couple of missions in this battalion. One of them we've highlighted, which was the long-range surveillance mission. But the other mission was the intelligence mission, and we had teams from our battalion, from a company in our battalion, specifically assigned all over the country, supporting various divisions and regimental combat teams or what we called the ACRs, the Armored Combat Regiments. But I'm sorry, the Armored Cavalry Regiments. The cavalry guys are going to get mad at me for screwing that up, so I need to correct that. But we had teams all over Iraq functioning in that fashion as we call them THTs, tactical human teams. And in this instance, this team was assigned to a division in the north, and they did take in someone that walked in that wanted to give information about the whereabouts of these two people, in this case Saddam Hussein's sons. And at that point, the rest is history. Everyone knows the story and how that all unfolded. But yeah, we were extremely proud of the small part we had in that. But we also think it was a very important part.
Absolutely, and the attention to detail and the recognition that something like that was important and moving that up the chain for action was critical to that success. Before we leave the operational mission at Abu Ghraib, can you talk a little bit about the long-range surveillance teams and the forward deployment and how important that was to the mission?
So that's a good question. So the long-range surveillance company in this battalion was a core headquarters capability. So we were assigned to 5th Corps, commonly known as Victory Corps, and so we were the LURS, what's called the LURS C, so LURS Corps. There are LURS Ds as well, so LURS units in divisions. But we were specifically a capability of the Corps at the time. And basically, these are infantry unit. This is an infantry unit that does early warning. It does surveillance. It does patrolling missions. It's a forward presence in any type of organization or operation. So, really one of the first type of organizations that are involved in combat operations. We call it inserting them early and forward of friendly units. So a really tough mission. Most of the officers, NCOs, and soldiers in this type of organization are Ranger certified infantrymen, and their mission is dangerous. They are the eyes and ears in early combat operations for the Corps, and then later, as the mission changed for us in Iraq, they became what we called a counter IED, counter mortar patrolling organization and element, trying to give us early warning on some possible attacks.
I'd like to switch a little bit now to a little bit of discussion around how important logistics is to an army. And you had an acronym I really liked in the book called VANI, if I have that right. And can you talk a little bit about that? You talked about the mayor and how important bartering and honesty was with the locals.
Thanks for bringing that. So VANI is actually Bob's saying. It means value added, no issue. It's a great way to say, you're going to do your job and you're not going to complain about it, right? I mean, it's sort of the simple way of bringing it to light. But logistics, there's a famous quote about logistics, and I'm going to get it wrong, but I'll paraphrase it. But it's something that goes like this: tactics is for amateurs, logistics is for experts. Everything about the Army is and the Army's success is about logistics. And in my case, in this unit, I had a logistics officer that was just outstanding and completely understood it. So he was able to resource us, all the time and keep the unit functioning. And it goes back to even the early days in Balad when we were simply trying to find sandbags to put around our tents so that we could protect our sleeping areas. And let me explain that for a second, because that's kind of interesting to understand. We would build sandbag barriers along the perimeters of all of our tents, just to the height of where someone was sleeping. So if you're sleeping on a cot, then the sandbags simply went 2 levels above where your cot was at, so that it would protect you from any shrapnel that would come in from the sides of the tent. And so it wouldn't obviously protect you from something that came in the top of the tent, but it would if there was shrapnel flying around, at that level while you were sleeping or resting. So, things like that, Romeo did a great job of figuring out. But what we did in this battalion was we leveraged the local population. We had 3 Iraqi contractors that would work for us. They would help us with services. They would go to places we couldn't go. They had more freedom of movement into Baghdad and other places to get certain things we might need. But in the book, I highlight specifically one story, which I think it just highlights the character of people and of human beings. And we had a contractor. His name was Amar, and we had asked him, Romeo and I had asked him to go to Baghdad and have a tarp made so that we could put shade over our mechanics who were working on vehicles in the sun. So we wanted to shade the work area at Abu Ghraib with a really large tarp. And Amar went to Baghdad, and he had the tarp made. We said, okay, and he brought us the tarp. So then we gave him basically a receipt that he could take up to Balad, where the contracting office was at, and the finance office, and he could collect his payment for having the tarp made and his labor. And so the tarp in total was $2,500. And so Amar we gave him his receipt after he delivered the tarp. He went up to Balad to get paid, and the finance office paid him $25,000. So he came back to us immediately and told us there was a mistake in payment and gave us the money minus his $2,500 so that we could return it to the Army finance system. Now, if you think about this, he could have immediately just took that 25,000 and faded away into the landscape of Iraq and never come back to us again. But what it did for us is it validated our human connection with the Iraqi population and the people we were working with while we were in Iraq in this time period. And it also gave us a sense of trust as well, because he was completely honest with us that he had been overpaid for this specific mission that we had asked him to accomplish. And we were just overwhelmed and shocked by his honesty and his ability to come to us and trust us. And he ended up staying with us for the entire tour. And then what we did when we were leaving is we introduced him to the unit that was replacing us so that he could continue on and continue to have employment with the U.S. Army while we were in Iraq. One of the things I always thought about him that was really interesting was he was very simple about what he wanted to do. And one of his goals, he used to tell me, was he just wanted to buy his mother a freezer or a refrigerator for her house. And that was one of his goals for working, with U.S. forces and helping us get some of the logistics things that we needed that we couldn't get ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great story. You're right. If he just decided that he was never going to go back, he would have been reaping the rewards of that difference, right?
Well,
Uh,
I mean, absolutely. He would have, again, $25,000 cash to a young Iraqi contractor who's in his 20s. I mean, he could have lived on that for years, based on the economic environment at the time and those type of things. So it was a big risk for him. But what he did was the honest thing. But he also built a relationship with us that we wouldn't leave him. We weren't leaving him alone, to try to do all of it on his own.
And obviously, it says something about him, but I also think it says something about the unit as well, because I think he felt connected and felt a part of it. Um, Let me talk a little bit now, Bill, if I can, about the disc. And you mentioned that scenario that happened in the book relative to a disc being provided, which formed the basis for a what the military calls a 15-6 investigation, which became known as the Abu Ghraib investigation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the good news for me is as a executive officer in that specific instance, I was on the periphery. That was really what Bob, who was my co-author on this project, was he was trying to articulate. But what ended up happening is this disc came to be reality. It had data on it. It had other, data in general could be. It had documents. It had pictures, everything. And it it did, support that 15-6 investigation, which is a common term for an investigation in Army units, to get to the bottom of something that may not be right. And in this case, um, we all know the story or the history of what happened before the 165th got to Abu Ghraib, and in this case, really Bob Walters led this effort for us as a battalion. He also protected us as a battalion, and as a leader protected us from all of the investigation things that were happening surrounding Abu Ghraib. And it's one of the things that I like to talk about with people is about how Bob stood up for the unit during that time, even though we had nothing to do with the incidents of Abu Ghraib, and our mission was to establish discipline standards and accountability and to fix Abu Ghraib. At some point, you still sort of get drawn into the investigation, and Bob did all of that as the commander, and kept us focused on the primary mission, which was conduct operations, build security at Abu Ghraib, and raise the living conditions for our soldiers while we were there. So all credit to him.
I'd like to end with two areas that I'd like you to dig into a little bit. January 2004, you talk about the intense rocket and mortar attack that happened at Abu Ghraib. Uh, can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. So that was a turning point for us in that deployment. We uh, in a timeline perspective, so everyone listening, we were fully established on Abu Ghraib with presence of Romeo Qureshi. So I didn't talk about this earlier, but on that day after we were told to go down and fix Abu Ghraib, I took Romeo Qureshi down there and I left him there to start building the infrastructure. And he was doing that by himself with the help of our Iraqi contractors. And so he was literally doing everything he could to get the infrastructure established so that I could go back to Balad and bring the battalion down there in total, close to 400 soldiers, so that we could walk into a functioning tactical operations center, a functioning personnel center, all the things that we needed as examples to get the mission rolling on Abu Ghraib. In January, I had come back from a patrol, and on the way into the FOB, we had picked up, a movie that we wanted to watch with all of the battalion staff. We wanted to have sort of a team building event and watch a movie together. So I got with the communications officer and I said, "Hey, can you set up something so we can view a movie and invite all of the staff, invite the personnel and the logistics and the ops and the commo team and et cetera, et cetera." So a bunch of people. And I think what you're asking me is about the mortar attack. So I'll go. That's what I'm referring to here. We set up in a little room inside one of the. It's a room we had created with plywood, but it was inside of a former textile factory or a facility. and we fire up the movie, and we're into the movie only for a few minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and we get hit with mortars and rockets, and there are different assessments of how many they were or what it was, but we think it was somewhere between 90 and 100 mortars and rockets within a couple minutes span. So it completely um, does a lot of damage on the fob. In fact, the roof of the building was coming in and coming down on us, and so at that point we went into our mission mode, which was CASEVAC, determining who was hurt, and doing all of our medical battle drills at that time. Once all of that was done, and we did have several soldiers at that time wounded, and there were actually people that were killed in the compound during that event as well. But once that was all done, and we were at a point where we could take a deep breath and then do an AAR, which is an after action review of how we operated. I said to the commo officer, I said, "Hey, let's fire the movie back up, and get everyone back in here so we can get back on the horse or the bike, as they say, so that people are a little more comfortable." So the surprising point of all of this was, and the funny point is, when I went back over to the place where we were showing the movie, everyone that had come back to watch the remainder of the movie was sitting in the room with their flak vests on and their helmets. So it was really funny.
Yes, I have a vision of them sitting around waiting for the movie to come back. That's a great story. And I'd like to end with when you obviously change of mission happened. Now you're back in Germany. Your tour was ended there, and now you're getting back together with your family, and knowing that your wife Dana and your two daughters were handling things on the home front exceptionally well, and then you came back, and now we're trying to get to normal.
No, yeah, thanks for asking that. It's a great point to bring up. At this time, so the Army was not uh, well. It was we were OIF 1, so we were the first units to deploy into combat into Iraq at this time. And the concept of family reintegration was new to everyone, and we didn't know what it meant, and we didn't know what it looked like. And a lot of families struggled with it, right? And it goes back to my comments earlier about the strength of the soldier is really all the people standing behind him. And so in my case, I had a very strong wife, and my children were resilient and acclimated to the German environment by this time. And I was walking into an apartment that I had really never seen. I was walking into her daily routine and her organizational structure that I didn't know, and I was a disruptor at that point. And we talk about it all the time. And there's a part in the book where a friend of mine who read the book, he called me and he said, "Hey, the most prolific thing that I really want to highlight in this book is when Dana uh, mentions that she cried because you made her coffee." So
Yes,
I think just that simple um, example really exemplifies what it means to go to war, to come back, and then to reintegrate with your family. Well, now we got a lot better later on when I deployed again with other units, and then later in my career, I was a battalion commander back in Iraq in 2010 and 2011. We had really good programs and plans on how to reintegrate our families, and we also had a lot of experience. So my wife, as a battalion commander wife, later on was able to help the young wives and spouses. It's not just women, it's men as well. Help support their soldier come back. So we got better at it. But in this time period, I mean, we were crossing new ground. And again, some of these little nuances we talk about in the book, I think people should just pick it up and read it. Um, another friend of mine wrote me and said, "Bill, what you've given us in this book is inside baseball. You're giving us inside baseball that we don't know out in the private sector or in the civilian world, and thank you for that. And so that was one of the best compliments I've had. But again, all credit to my wife, Bob's wife, and all the wives and husbands that supported their soldier on the reentry back, because it isn't easy. It's not easy.
Well said, Bill. And I want to end this by letting folks know that you were awarded the Bronze Star for your combat service in the entire Iraq theater, as well as the Combat Action Badge for that incident that you talked about in January 2004. And again, I want to thank you for your service. It's been my pleasure to be here and my honor to be here with you today.
Hey, thanks a lot, Brian, and thanks to Emily and RANE for taking the time to hear the story. Thanks for reading the book. It's an honor for us to share this story. We, Bob and I, and Paul, our writing partner, we're grateful for that, and thank you very much.
Bill Edwards is a RANE Network member and the author of Inside Abu Ghraib, Memoirs of Two U.S. Military Intelligence Officers. The book is available on Amazon. Brian Lynch is the Executive Director of Safety and Security at RANE. We are a risk intelligence company that provides access to critical insights, analysis, and support to ensure business continuity and resiliency for our members. Find out how RANE can power your business to success. Visit us at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.